What if heroes arrived to liberate a city, not to the sound of joyous cheers, but to the hollow, haunting silence of starving children? That wasn't a thought experiment in the fall of 1944. It was the terrifying possibility staring back at the Netherlands as Operation Market Garden promised a rapid, glorious end to the war. Hope spread like wildfire. Parades imagined, families dreaming of reunions, radio broadcasts full of optimism. The mood was electric. But beneath the excitement, something fragile held together by rumor and risk. That fragile hope would be tested, and, as the months unfolded, it would be ripped apart. Hope curdles into a hard, bitter silence when Operation Market Garden falters. The daring gamble, parachutes, bridges, a rapid thrust into the Rhineland, stalls. Allied columns bog down. The promise of liberation recedes, leaving towns and farms exposed to occupation and reprisal. In a desperate act of solidarity, Dutch railway workers throw down their tools and stage a nationwide strike, halting trains to slow German troop movement and buy their country a sliver of leverage. It is a bold, dangerous gamble, a civilian refusal to cooperate that both signals resistance and invites retaliation. The mood shifts from optimism to dread. This is no longer a military setback, it's a looming civilian crisis. In Berlin, the mood hardened into something like fury. To the generals and ministers, the Dutch railway strike wasn't brave resistance, it was betrayal, an unforgivable cut at a moment when the front lines teetered. Tactical thinking slid into something colder and moralistic. Punishment was discussed in briefing rooms the way one discusses troop movements, with clipped voices and grim arithmetic. Behind maps and coffee cups, a conscious choice was made, not to bomb cities, but to break them slowly. Cut the lines that carry food and fuel, turn policy into a weapon, and make the Netherlands pay in empty plates and shivering nights. The order comes like a sentence, a full food embargo on the Western Netherlands. Trains that once carried bread and coal are halted. Trucks turned back. Fuel shipments stopped. No fanfare, no battlefield charge, just a bureaucratic command that will strangle a city block by block. The weapon isn't a bomb. It's ration cards and empty shelves. A slow, calculated denial of everything people need to live. For millions crowded into towns and farms, winter will arrive with no heat and no food. This is punishment turned policy, precise and pitiless, and it changes the war into something far more personal. As the first winds of winter blow, German authorities move with cold efficiency to enforce the blockade. Rail lines sit silent, food convoys turned back, checkpoints multiply like teeth along every road. The arteries of daily life are cut, markets empty, stoves go cold. What was a country becomes, overnight, a sealed cage. 4.5 million people trapped behind a deliberate, starving wall. The embargo falls like a curtain. Food trucks stopped, rail lines idle, fuel delivery severed, and with that, the official start of the Hongerwinter, the Hunger Winter. 4.5 million people find the map of their lives suddenly redrawn by empty larders and closed borders. It is not a bombing raid, but a slow, deliberate weaponization of starvation, and winter makes its cruelty worse. Houses go cold, shops lock their doors, children's stomachs rumble where laughter should be. Hope, once noisy and public, shrinks to a private, aching calculation. One more day, one more scrap. At first, the descent will be gradual. At first, it is a tightening, almost imperceptible. Rations shaved down a little, then a little more. Coupons that once bought bread now buy a single slice. Families crowd into one room to share warmth. Coal and peat disappear from stoves. Kids sleep under too few blankets and cough through the night. People whisper plans that never work. Chairs and tables are stacked to fuel a single fire. Homes go quiet as ovens cool. Markets thin out, then close. The cold makes hunger louder, and that slow, grinding slide towards something worse becomes impossible to ignore. By February 1945, the crisis stopped being an emergency and became a catastrophe. The official daily rations nosedived below 500 calories, then down to about 400, a starvation diet that cannot sustain even the weak. Muscles melted into bone. Hands trembled from cold and hunger. Mothers could not nourish crying infants. Fathers crumpled at work or simply didn't have the energy to go. Every small task turned monumental. Food that had once been ordinary now felt like a myth. And with those calorie counts, the infrastructure that had kept cities fed began to unspool. Bakeries faltered, markets emptied, and the staples people counted on vanished. With winter tightening its grip, people turned their homes into fuel depots, burning chairs, tables, even wardrobes piece by piece just to keep a fire alive. Rooms that once held laughter grew bare and bone cold. Streets emptied, whole neighborhoods moved indoors, leaving only thin columns of smoke to mark where life used to be. Children huddled under blankets, faces pinched and hollow. The air tasted of wood smoke and something heavier, the long, slow weight of despair. This wasn't only about heat anymore. It was the beginning of a deeper loss. Soon, even the bread would disappear. Then the food supply chain simply collapses. First, the bread disappears from bakery windows, no loaves warming the cold mornings. Then the potatoes vanish from the markets, crates emptied overnight. Shops lock their doors or hang a handwritten sign. Nothing. Supply wagons stall on frozen roads. Rumors turn into reality. Where once there was choice, now there is only empty shelves, whispered barters, and long lines of hungry faces. Families who trusted daily meals are suddenly scavengers, eyes scanning every cart, every backyard, for something, anything to keep the children alive. When the last potatoes and loaves were gone, desperation sent people into parks and vacant lots to forage. Mothers, because it is always mothers, dug bulbs from flower beds and boiled them for hours until a starchy, bitter pulp softened. Tulip bulbs, once prized for their beauty, became food, a toxic, stomach-churning paste that made small children gag, and then, driven by hunger, swallow. They knew it could sicken them. They knew it wasn't real nourishment. But with bellies hollow and nights freezing, shame and fear gave way to a fierce, simple calculation. Keep the child alive for one more day. The physical toll becomes horrifyingly visible. Doctors like Dr. Henrik Moulder watch the population turn into a living catalog of hunger, and they begin to record it with a grim, methodical precision. In damp wards and cramped homes, they note the same pattern. Sunken eyes, hollowed cheeks, muscles melting away, swollen bellies, and brittle hair. Symptoms repeated over and over until the pages look like evidence of a crime. Their notebooks fill with dates and sketches, little case histories of neighbors and patients who once laughed and worked and now move like shadows. Each entry is clinical, but behind the ink is a mounting, unbearable grief. And the cruelest truth. The youngest are paying the highest price. The youngest paid the steepest price. They grew too weak to play, too weak to attend school. Playgrounds were empty. Classrooms became holding cells for bodies that trembled with cold and hunger. Children slumped at desks, eyes hollow, ribs showing beneath thin clothing, and teachers, worn, helpless, watched students faint in aisles they could no longer lift. There were no scolding voices, no lessons, just the slow, terrifying inventory of what starvation takes, silence where laughter belonged. Doctors had begun to document the stages of decline, and soon men like Dr. Moulder would face choices no human should have to make. Dr. Moulder stands in a cold, crowded ward and feels the limits of medicine like a wall closing in. Short of food, short of fuel, short of relief. He sorts pills that won't fix the damage, adjusts thin blankets, offers the smallest comforts, a warm cloth, a quiet voice, a sip of what passes for nutrition. He writes notes by dim lamplight, listing signs he knows mean the end is near. Wasted limbs, blank stares, the slow fading of curiosity, and then makes the hardest call a doctor can make, to stop chasing cures and to focus on easing fear and pain, even as the young minds and bodies he treats are being robbed of a future. For parents, the psychological torture is unbearable. Day after day shrinks into a slow-motion horror film, little faces hollowing, bones showing through too big shirts, eyes that used to laugh now vacant and glassy. They pace, they bargain with ghosts, replay every meal they didn't save, every night they were away, searching for something, anything, that might keep a child alive. They ration love the way they ration bread, turning kisses into tasks, lullabies into lists of things to do. Sleep brings nightmares of empty plates. Waking brings the same impossible math. How to make one more morsel last till tomorrow. Hope becomes, quietly, unaffordable. Hope becomes an unaffordable luxury, an idea reserved for other people, other cities, other futures. Days shrink to a single animal task. Find one more morsel. Families ration breaths as well as bread, measuring time in mouthfuls and the weight of a child's cheek. Kitchens are quiet, cupboards are empty. Neighbors learn to trade coal for a potato, a shoelace for a cough lozenge. Mothers wake before dawn to stand in thin lines, hands numb, eyes scanning for anything edible. Nights blur into cold, low-light calculations. Who ate last? Who can go without? Who will wake tomorrow? Surviving becomes the only plan. Far from the frozen streets and hollow-eyed children, Allied command was not in the dark. Cable after cable, aerial photos, and undercover reports arrived on commanders' desks describing a slow, methodical starvation. Markets emptied, mothers boiling bulbs, hospitals overwhelmed. Those dispatches read like evidence, maps marked with food deliveries cut off, lists of malnourished towns, eyewitness accounts of children too weak to stand. And they changed the tenor of conversations in London and Washington from abstract sympathy to grim, operational awareness. Still, every urgent report had to be weighed against a single, brutal question. Could the war's end wait while a nation starved? Allied commanders read the intelligence and the pictures and felt that cold, impossible weight. The maps told one story, the reports another. A final, bloody push into Germany promised to shorten the war and, perhaps, spare lives on a much larger scale. So, the brutal calculus was made. The liberation of the Western Netherlands would have to wait. For the millions trapped by the embargo, that was no neutral decision. It was a sentence. Generals argued supply lines and windows of opportunity. Planners measured risks and lives like figures on a ledger. And everywhere between the front and the famine, the question hung in the air. Could help possibly arrive in time? As weeks turned into months, the death toll climbed, and the Netherlands changed its face. Streets that once hummed with trams and market cries fell silent. Windows darkened. Playgrounds froze under a thin crust of winter. People moved like ghosts, hunched, hollow-eyed, voices shrunk to whispers. Hospitals overflowed with children who'd stopped sleeping and parents who'd stopped bargaining with hope. Where ovens had baked bread, only smoke rose from burning furniture. Lists of names grew longer. The city's pulse slowed to a faint, irregular thump, and each night the empty rooms kept the memory of lives slipping away. Finally, in late April 1945, with the end of the war finally visible on the horizon, A quiet but monumental breakthrough happens. Allied command manages to negotiate a truce with the occupying German forces, not because either side had suddenly grown sentimental, but because the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe had become impossible to ignore. The agreement is narrow and precarious. Safe corridors, temporary ceasefires, permission for food and medical relief to cross front lines. It is hope measured in fragile terms. Still, for starving families who had only counted days, it is the first real promise of help in months, a door, however small, that can finally be opened. After a fragile truce, Operation Manna begins. RAF bombers, machines meant to rain destruction, skim the gray Dutch skies, flying unnaturally low. Crews open bomb bays not to unleash metal, but to let down life. Below, frozen fields and hollow-faced towns watch as parachutes bob like pale flowers against winter. And for a country starved into silence, those planes become a fragile, dangerous kind of hope. Then, in a surreal flip of expectations, the bombers' bellies open and crates spill out, not explosives, but bundles of bread, milk, and tinned food. The planes fly low. White parachutes drift like slow, impossible snow. On the frozen streets, people stop. Starving men and women look up, hands trembling, children cry out, tears of shock and relief. For a moment the world tilts, destruction turned to mercy, hope dropping from the sky. Not long after the RAF began Manna, the Americans launched Operation Chowhound. B-17 bombers stripped of armament and packed with food, flying low and steady. They poured thousands of tons of K-rations into fields, parks, and city squares, metal crates tumbling under parachutes. The sound was like thunder gone soft, and below, starving people reached up, desperate hands closing on a lifeline. The airdrops become a lifeline. Parachutes drifting like strange, sudden blossoms against a gray sky. Each crate a small miracle. People run into frozen streets, hands trembling as they tear open boxes that smell like coffee and meat and possibility. Mothers lifting filthy, skeletal children to taste something warm for the first time in months. Sobs and quiet laughter breaking the winter silence. Those low-flying planes are more than supply lines. They are a signal. The world remembers. Still, the relief is immediate and fragile. Vital, yes, but scattered and short-lived. A reprieve rather than a cure. The airdrops felt like a miracle at first. Parachutes blooming over frozen fields, crates tumbling down like answered prayers. But very quickly they revealed a harsher truth. Comfort from the sky could not undo months of systematic starvation. Crates landed in open fields, not in living rooms. Roads were still blocked, bakeries closed, and children so weakened that food had to be given carefully, slowly, with doctors at hand. What the Netherlands needed was steady, ground-based relief. Open highways, convoys, clinics, clean water, and nurses to nurse fragile bodies back to life. The sky had thrown a lifeline. Only boots on the ground could haul people back to shore. In the first days of May, the long, brittle patience of the Netherlands finally cracked. German commanders laid down their arms. Checkpoints fell quiet, and the roads, once barricaded and watched, were thrown open. For a population that had lived on rumor and ration cards, that unclasping of the highways felt like a miracle in slow motion. Not a parade, but a practical promise of food, fuel, and care. Liberation was no longer an echo on the radio. It was at hand, rolling toward them. They rolled in like an answer at last. American and Canadian convoys easing through blown checkpoints into towns that had just been handed back to the living. Jeeps and half-tracks kicked up road dust. Helmets turned toward unfamiliar quiet. Riding among them was Staff Sergeant William Cooper, a combat veteran who had seen the worst the war could offer. He rode low in his seat, exhausted and alert, braced for cheers he'd seen before, but not yet prepared for what awaited. Cooper and his men expected joyous welcome. Cheering crowds, waving flags, the raucous celebrations they've seen in France and Belgium. After months of mud and gunfire, they brace for smiles, songs, and open arms. They straighten their packs, pat their helmets, and imagine, for a beat, trading the front line for a moment of relief and ordinary joy. They expected cheers, flags, noise, the kind of welcome you'd read about in dispatches. Instead, they were met with a ghostly, unnerving quiet. Streets that should have been full of celebration were lined with people who looked like skeletons, hollowed cheeks, ribs visible beneath threadbare coats, eyes sunken into empty sockets. No laughter, no shouts, just a slow, ragged procession of bodies moving as if the very air weighed them down. Some leaned on doorframes, fingers clutching empty hands. Others stood motionless, staring with a stunned, animal vacancy. The sight stripped the war of its drama and left one terrible truth. These people were spent. They came ready for celebration, trucks, boots, the kind of noise that marks an end, only to be met by a silence so absolute it felt like a crime scene. No cheers, no horns, just a heavy, held breath over empty streets, rows of people whose faces read like maps of hunger, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, mouths that no longer make sound. Even the little noises, distant wood smoke, a loose shutter, seemed muffled, irrelevant. The city's life had been siphoned away until there was nothing left to celebrate. The absence of joy landed on the soldiers like a physical blow. But then Cooper sees the children. They don't run toward the trucks or shout for candy. They stand in the street, motionless and unnervingly small, their bodies wasted by hunger. Ribs show through thin shirts, cheeks hollowed, eyes glassy and vacant. Tiny hands hang lax or clutch a rag like a relic. There is no noise but the soft scrape of feet on cobblestones and the brittle whisper of breath. Whatever toughness war taught Cooper, it falls away. This sight is quieter, crueler, and somehow harder to bear. The sight is more shocking than any battlefield, because here the violence is silent, invisible, and precise. Hunger carved into cheekbones, eyes too large for their faces, small hands dangling as if weightless. These are not casualty statistics, but living photographs. Each child a tiny, still frame that tells the story of a deliberate cruelty. No shelling, no smoke, just the slow arithmetic of deprivation. Days without bread, nights without heat, bodies wasting away while the world kept fighting elsewhere. For Cooper and the men who expected cheers, this is a different kind of combat, one that stuns the senses and refuses any simple response. No training or tactic had prepared him for those hollow faces. Cooper's hands move on instinct. He rummages in his pack and pulls out a simple chocolate bar, wrapped, ordinary, and in that moment it feels like a small, impossible offering of mercy. He stepped closer, slow and careful, and knelt to meet her at eye level, folding his height into a smaller shape so he wouldn't scare her. From his pack he produced a single chocolate bar and extended it on an open palm, gentle, almost reverent. The girl's eyes, huge and hollow, lifted to it and held, fixated as if the small rectangle contained all hope. Her fingers close around the bar like it's a lifeline, trembling, impossibly thin, the skin at her knuckles stretched tight over bone. Yet she holds it as if she knows, instinctively, that this small, mundane thing is suddenly everything. The chocolate smells faintly of cocoa and candy wrappers, a ghost of normal life that somehow cuts through months of cold and quiet. For Sergeant Cooper, the moment is absurdly simple, one small reward handed to a child. For the girl, and for everyone watching, it feels like a spell dissolving, the stiffness in shoulders loosening, a first, impossible flicker of trust and hope where there had been only hunger and fear. From doorways and alleyways, dozens more skeletal children emerge, drawn by the impossible sight of food and the quieter miracle of kindness. They don't shout or beg, they simply stand, thin hands folded or dangling, faces rimmed with soot, eyes wide and hollow, as if stunned into belief. Some clutch ragged dolls, some press a palm to their mouths, as if testing whether hunger is real. The street holds its breath. The sight is a small, terrible miracle that needs no words. And for the soldiers watching it, it becomes an unmistakable call to something beyond duty. In an instant, everything changed for Sergeant Cooper and his men. Years of drill and doctrine, orders, maps, objectives, fell away as if someone had wiped the slate clean. The mission that had been measured in kilometers and enemy positions telescoped into a single, unbearable fact. These children were dying. Military protocol dissolved into instinct. The algebra of strategy was replaced by the simple, desperate calculus of survival. A chocolate bar, a crust of bread, a warm spoonful. Men who had spent months counting bullets found themselves counting bites, moved not by orders but by a human refusal to walk past a child in need. Hardened by combat, these men felt something unnameable loosen inside them. Not orders, not strategy, but a human reflex. Without a word, helmets tilted, packs were shrugged off, and they moved as one toward the thin, pale figures clustered in doorways. Fingers that learned recoil and trigger now fumbled with ration tins, with chocolate bars, with blankets. A booted knee became a stool for a child to climb onto. There was no formal command, only a quiet, urgent choreography. Pass it here, open it there, hold this hand. In that instant, the uniform stopped meaning fighter and began to mean keeper, and they became, in every small motion, saviors. They emptied their trucks. They opened crates and unsealed cans with hands that still remembered pulling triggers and patching wounds, hands that now moved with something softer, haste and reverence at once. Personal rations were piled on curbs, chocolate bars clinked in palms, tins of corned beef and powdered milk passed from soldier to soldier in a line that looked more like a human chain than an army supply run. No manifest. No orders. Each loaf was unwrapped as if it were an offering, each biscuit placed into a child's fingers with the careful ceremony of someone giving life back. For a moment, the war's rules fell away, and mercy wrote the orders. For many soldiers, the act of placing a piece of bread into the hand of a starving child becomes more profound and meaningful than any battle they have ever fought. A grubby palm meets a roughened, gloved one. A warm, stale loaf feels more valuable than a medal. They have seen youth blown apart by shrapnel, shouted into chaos, yet here, in the hush of ruined streets, the smallest human contact rewrites their purpose. They kneel. They feed. In that quiet exchange, uniforms and ranks fall away, and what remains is a simple, urgent duty. Keep this small life alive. The joy, when it finally comes, is not loud or triumphant. It arrives like one held breath released. A mother bending over her child, fingers trembling as a scrap of bread touches fevered lips. The little face stills, then begins to chew, and someone nearby lets out a choked sob. No parades, no banners, just raw, private relief. Tears, gratitude, the simple, miraculous return of hunger to satiety. Around them, neighbors share the little they have. A hesitant smile flickers on a child's face. Soldiers watch, humbled, realizing this small mercy matters more than any map or medal, and the first fragile threads of recovery are being sown. The road to recovery begins. Allied forces set up specialized clinics to nurse nearly 200,000 severely malnourished children back to health, a long, delicate process that requires more than just food. First comes stabilization, Warm blankets, careful fluids, tiny portions of nourishing broth, medics watching for faltering hearts, and the lethal paradox of refeeding. Progress is measured in grams gained, in quiet sighs, in the slow return of color to a cheek. Doctors, nurses, Red Cross volunteers, and even soldiers tend broken bodies and battered spirits. It is slow, fragile work, and as physical wounds heal, the work of restoring childhood is only just beginning. But the healing wasn't only physical. After clinics tended broken bodies, the soldiers began to stitch back a lost life, turning bombed-out courtyards into makeshift classrooms, carving swings from scrap wood, teaching sums and songs between ration lines. They read picture books to children who'd forgotten how to laugh, organized rough soccer games where the ball meant more than sport. It meant permission to be a child again. Care was patient and small, slow feedings, warm blankets, and extra hour of play. Step by step, trust returned. Those quiet, ordinary acts became the real work of recovery, repairing souls as much as skeletons, and paving the way for a deeper peace. The Hongerwinter didn't end with parades or military maps. It ended with quiet, desperate acts. Soldiers kneeling to offer a stolen chocolate bar. Medics coaxing a child to swallow a warm spoonful of soup. Volunteers turning emptied schools into places to play and learn again. Those small gestures stitched a broken society back together, one fragile body and one stunned smile at a time, as clinics rebuilt strength and soldiers became teachers and nurses for a while. In the end, the measure of victory was not how much ground was taken, but how many tiny hands were fed and given a future. The most powerful weapon in that war was, simply, our shared humanity.